Hi, it's Dr. Crone again. In this video, I'm going to talk about the difference between dual federalism and cooperative federalism. There are two types of the system of federalism. Dual federalism is one in which there's a strict separation of power between the states and the federal government. And each level of government only works on the areas of policy that it's been assigned to in the Constitution. So that would be the enumerated powers for the national government and the reserved powers for the states. Your textbook has a lot more information on what those are. Dual federalism was a system that mostly happened in the United States in the 1800s and early 1900s, basically from the beginning of the nation's government under the Constitution up until about 1930 or so. Cooperative federalism is a second type of federalism system. And in this system, the national and the state governments are actually working together in a specific policy area. This started in the 1930s and it has grown since then. Political scientists like to use a cake analogy to talk about the differences between these two types of federalism. So imagine that the chocolate part of a cake represents the national government's power, and the vanilla part of the cake represents the state government's power. In a layer cake like the one on the left, the two flavors are completely separate and they don't mix. And this analogy is like dual federalism, where the areas of power and responsibility for both the states and the national government are very separate. For example, in the chocolate layer, in a dual federalism system, the national government would be busy carrying out its enumerated powers of defense of the United States and international trade. While in the vanilla layer, the states would be busy carrying out their responsibility in all the other areas of policy that aren't enumerated, what we call the reserved powers. The other form of federalism, cooperative federalism, is more like what we call a marble cake. So in a marble cake, like the one on the right, the two flavors mix together, and it's hard to tell where one starts and the other one ends. And this is like cooperative federalism, where there's a blend of state and national responsibilities within a certain policy area. An example of this would be the program called Medicaid. So why did cooperative federalism develop, and why especially did it develop in the 1930s? In the early part of our country, states were very independent from each other. But as time went on, technological advances made it easier to communicate between the states and easier to transport items between the states. And this led to a lot more trade and interconnection in the states' economies. And it also led to what we call regional specialization in economies. For example, you might have one state or area specializing in agriculture while another specialized in industry. Or today we could think that there are many states where they specialize in high tech. As the state economies, because of this, became more interconnected with each other, that meant that economic problems would go from just being regional issues to being national problems. And so as economic problems became national in scope, it became clear that it wasn't going to be enough for the states to control their own economies quite as tightly as they did. And this got its first giant test by the economic disaster of the Great Depression that happened starting with the stock market failure of 1929 and continuing throughout the decade of the 1930s. That left states unable to cope. It was such a big interrelated economic disaster that one particular state was unable to cope with the problems of poverty, unemployment, bank failures on their own. Instead, the states began to look to the national government, and the people of the United States began to look to the national government for help. As a response to the Great Depression, the national government began to create really big national government programs that would provide financial help to the people of the states And in order to enact those giant programs, things like Medicare, Social Security, or today the Affordable Care Act, for example, the national government had to rely on states to cooperate and participate in carrying out those very large programs. A lot of students get fooled by the word cooperative, which of course sounds like it's a very positive thing, to thinking that states are perfectly happy with this and that this is all sort of a kumbaya, wonderful, we all get along kind of a way of doing policy. Don't be fooled by that. Cooperative federalism was really a major expansion of national power into areas that used to be completely sovereign to the states. Things like how a state would deal with people in poverty, or how they would provide care to senior citizens or retirees. So that was a big expansion of power, and the states weren't always happy with it. Nobody likes to have power taken away from them. Today, the states still do retain some sovereignty in some policy areas, and your textbook goes into a lot of detail about the nuances of that. But in practice today, the states are really dependent on the financial resources of the federal government in order to run programs that, especially that provide a lot of financial assistance to the people of their states. And that means that the national government has really become more powerful by enacting cooperative federalism than it ever was under dual federalism.